Hey everybody, it's Gregg Bendian, and we're back at the ProgCast. Today we're taking things in a direction that we've gone into several times before, talking about the music of Ornette Coleman, and who better to help me do that and get into some of his concepts than one of his sidemen and a longtime collaborator of Ornette, keyboardist Dave Bryant. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Greg, long-time listener, first-time participant. Good to be here.
Good to have you. I know that we did one for your channel on YouTube talking about Ornette, and we played a gig that night at the Cambridge, which church?
Harvard Epworth.
Harvard, and with the great bass player Hilliard Green, who's also going to be a guest on this show.
Oh, great.
Played some Ornette tunes, played some Dave Bryant tunes, but pre-concert had an interview with Dave where I was talking about my different experiences and takes on Ornette's music and how I kind of relate him or not to Cecil Taylor. And Dave, as a keyboard player, it's so interesting to me because there have been so few keyboard players that have worked with Ornette. And I'm kind of curious how you came into his field of vision in terms of, well, I need a keyboard player now all of a sudden.
Well, it was more like I needed a mentor all of a sudden. I had kind of gotten to a place, and this is kind of going to be overlapping Venn diagram, overlapping with your universe a little bit. I think probably simultaneous pursuits of interest in like the avant-garde with not only Ornette but Cecil and the art ensemble, a lot of things that were happening in the mid to late 70s, and at the same time with electronic music and trying to find a solo voice on instruments like the mini Moog with the pitch bend wheel a la Jan Hammer, and starting to feel increasingly not at home on the piano, even though that was my instrument. But a lot of the music I was listening to didn't have a piano, or it was Cecil, but that was Cecil is so strong. It's like you're either playing like him or you're not playing like him. And so I was finding some expression in techniques that had to do with playing in the cracks between the note, escaping equal temperament. And so at the time, I had some friends who were going for those, I think they were NEA grants at the time, where it's like you try to get the prospective teacher to sign up and they'll get a grant, and then, you'll spend some time with them. And I had a friend that tried to hook up with Cecil that way. I knew somebody else that was going to try to talk to Elvin Jones about doing it. When I was at Berkeley, I remember I didn't know him very well, but we had some close friends in common, Steve Vai, and I remember him running out of his dorm room shouting, "Frank called back! Frank called back!" And I remember just having that there was this thing in the air of people reaching out to artists and just trying to connect. And I thought, I'm just such a layabout. I thought, I have no idea how to I'm still a horrible PR person. That aspect of this is just not up my alley. And so I thought, if I could connect with somebody, that would be a thing. And I thought, who would I like to study with if I got one of those grants? And I thought piano players, and I thought, Cecil, who else? Keith Jarrett. I thought, these guys, I don't know. I think if I had a chance to speak with either of them, the last question I would have asked would have been about the piano.
Mm-hmm.
So as I figured that would be the last thing that they would give up some information about. But now I think, at least maybe Keith later in life had mellowed a little bit about it. But, I figured Cecil would probably rather talk about ballet or his favorite bridge architects or something like
Architecture
that.
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And I thought, well, I couldn't really hold my end of the conversation up with that. And looking around, I remember thinking, boy, Ornette would be like the perfect guy to study with because he's sort of anti-piano. And so it wouldn't even come up that way. And at the same time, too, I was very much in the thrall of the Fringe, our friends, George Garzone and Bob Galati and their trio they had with Rich Appleman, later John Lockwood, and as the hometown heroes here in Berkeley, in Boston. And so I had this sort of idea in my head of kind of wanting to crash that party, to see how the other half lived. What was it that made them uncomfortable with the piano? And I figured if I could solve that problem, then I could solve the problem of whatever my personal discomfort was with the instrument, So I wanted to be able to bridge that. And so I didn't think too much more about it. And Bruce Thomas, who played with a group Ornette had called the White House Band, that was a rehearsal band that never went out, from what I understand.
But I can recall some things about the group, and I'm wondering if it wasn't it just called White House?
I always heard the White House Band from these guys, but this was
through
John Snyder. You must have heard about it, right?
Yeah, but also wasn't George Cartwright in it?
I don't know who else was in it. I just know Bruce and I think his brother, and I'm not sure who the other people were. I think on a Google search one time, I did find a page out there that had some information about it. But and I keep thinking I should talk to Bruce about it and see if he wants to get some reminiscences on the record. But I had a friend who worked in the ensemble office at Berkeley, and he came back one evening and said, I talked to a guy today who says he played piano with Ornette. Well, that was like telling me he just met an astronaut. I mean, that was an imaginary gig that didn't exist. I couldn't even conceive of it. And so I thought, I got to find this guy. And so I tracked him down at school. He was a new faculty member, and he just retired, I think, in the past few years. But I told him what I was interested in. Love to talk to you about it. Oh, sure. It's end of semester right now. I'm grading finals. We'll talk next semester after I get this. Tracked him down again. Couldn't make it happen. So when I had to go in again to select a private lesson instructor for the next semester, I said, I want Bruce Thomas. And since he was brand new, I waltzed right in. And first lesson, I said, man, I'm not going to beat around the bush. I'm here to talk about Ornette. And he was great. He brought in manuscript books of things Ornette had written out for him. He brought in cassettes of rehearsals. He answered every stupid question I had, every stupid, desperate at that age, question I had. And around that time, too, I'm thinking this was 81. There was an interview with Ornette in Downbeat with Howard Mandel, I think. And Ornette mentioned something that a student of his had said to him recently. And Bruce, I asked Bruce, does he have students? Could I study with Ornette? And he goes, well, I don't know. I guess I may have heard him talk about that once or twice, he said, but sure, you could call him up, give it a try. What's he going to say? No. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. So he was going to be at Berkeley with Prime Time. I think this was December of 81. And a friend of mine worked sound at the Performance Center, and he snuck me into the sound check. And I watched the sound check. And then at the end of it, went backstage, jumped down backstage. I had never been backstage at the Performance Center before, and looked around, and it was deserted. They cleared out. And so I'm so nervous. I get some water from the water fountain. As I stand up with my cheeks full of water, somebody goes, "Hi, how you doing?" As they walk by, and it's Ornette. And I'm choked down the water, flagging down. Yeah, give him my life story in 15 seconds. Piano, Bruce Thomas, blah, 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 blah. Would it be possible to study with you sometime, have a lesson? And he goes, "Oh, yeah, I think that'd be possible." He said, "I'll be in the book in a couple of weeks." He says, "Give me a call and we'll send it up." And he says, "If you want to write to me, you can write to me through my manager, Sid Bernstein." Because, at the time, I think he'd heard that, the Bernsteins put the Beatles in Shea Stadium. So he wanted a little piece of that action. So
Yes.
in that world, that makes plenty of sense. So I did send him a letter through the management, which he never received. But first of all, when I tell this story to students now, I have to explain what in the book means, because nobody knows what in the book means. The telephone directory. And usually in show business, somebody says, "I'll be in the book," or whatever. That's a nice way of saying, "Good luck finding me." But a few weeks later, I remember I called up New York information, asked for the number of Ornette Coleman. I remember the operator said, "Is that a business?"
Yeah.
Yeah, he hopes so.
For the book, and in fact, we would steal them from the sidewalks in New York to bring over to New Jersey. And Paul Motion was in the phone book, so I could call him up and bother him.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, that's the New York directory. I would imagine that was a real, like Houses of the Stars map in Los Angeles or something, right?
It was hot.
So, um, I called him up. We had a very nice conversation. I sent him a tape of my Berkeley senior recital where I played Dee Dee, which we have recorded and performed. And that was a really great homecoming for me to come back around. And just as an aside, I know, as I was telling you before our CD was released, I listened to that original version of Dee Dee, which of course was recorded with Charnet's father playing drums, and then our version with Charnette. And I remember thinking, "Oh gosh, I really don't want to have to suffer this comparison." And I thought, but I don't want to be the second person who does it. I want to know how bad it is before it goes out there. And I was pleasantly surprised by how much stuff the three of us, with obviously, as you know, no rehearsal for that CD, but just on our own, had learned from those recordings and those musicians. And it just sounded, it didn't sound to me, we were evoking that kind of playing. We weren't slavishly copying it, but it sounded affectionate. It sounded informed. It sounded comfortable through familiarity, that was just really nice. I really felt good about it. And I thought, all right, well, I think I can put this out now, felt pretty good. But anyway, also, the other thing I wanted to make sure we got to in our chat today, because you're so well versed in this type of thing, was the other thing that I had been looking at, besides trying to work out Ornette's harmonic ideas, was applying techniques from visual narrative to music. And so one thing, I was reading some stuff like Sergei Eisenstein, the Soviet silent filmmaker, the Battleship Potemkin, and some other things. Some of his ideas about montage theory, that type of film editing techniques. And I hadn't read comics for a long time, but I'd gone through pretty intense period of, 66 through 72, say, of comic book fandom when I was a kid. And I remembered, oh yeah, this was before home video. And I certainly didn't have a moviola in my dorm room. And I thought, I remember some of those guys had these kind of cinematic techniques. And so the next time I went home for the holidays, I went down in the basement, dug out all my old comic books, picked out some of my favorites, like by Will Eisner, Jim Steranko, our mutual friend, and brought them back, and I would practice with a page open to a favorite sequence, look at it and think, all right, well, what would the musical analog of that sequence be? And so had some ideas there, because I was just trying to find some organizing principles, and I knew I wanted to improvise freely, but to have it informed by composition and informed by other organizational techniques, and be able to figure out how people who were good storytellers, good communicators that way. There's that whole thing of time going either horizontally in chronological time, or that thing that you see so much in 20th century art. Yeah, where it's right now, right now, right now, right now, right now. It's always right now. Oh, and by the way, does that book have the Captain America stories in the back? There's one volume of that has the
to those that are listening and not watching, Dave and I were introduced, I believe, by the Marvel artist Jim Steranko. That sound right, Dave?
He asked me if I knew you, and I didn't. And then I went to see one of the Mahavishnu Project gigs and gave you a tape of me playing with Bottle Roy, something we'd done.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah. So there, Jim's work. Yeah, there was another book that had one of the Captain America stories. You know, where Madam Hydra breaks the mirror.
Well, and that's where there's the tombstone on the cover, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that sequence, that's like a literal transposition of Eisenstein to the page. So that's where the two come together. But I wrote two pieces, one dedicated to Eisenstein, one dedicated to Steranko, that were on my senior recital. And then I had Dee Dee on the senior recital. And I have spent the rest of my life living out my senior recital, pretty much. But so I got in touch with Jim after that, and he was very receptive, to the work I was doing. So that was has been a wonderful friendship.
Yeah, and then simultaneously, I did the Requiem for Jack Kirby in 2001, and didn't know that anybody else had drawn inspiration from comic book art. And so I think that was something that we connected on right away.
Yeah.
A lot of the same interests in visual storytelling, for sure. And how it affects narrative and in improvising, I think, is a good way to look at it.
Yeah, and for me, that whole thing of, as I said, chronological time, that beginning, middle, and end, dramatic form, tension and release, and so forth, as opposed to it's always right now. And that's what I heard a lot in, well, like in Primetime's music. It's always right now.
Well, I wanted to ask you about this. As someone who played in a version of Primetime and also was aware of the 2 bass, 2 guitar, 2 drum Primetime, what was your take on Ornette's goal? What was he trying to achieve in Primetime? What was Primetime to you?
I don't, I never asked him that exact question. So anything I'd say, it'd have to be a semi-educated guess. But I think part of it was, I think he wanted a lot of input, for improvising. And I remember when I used to go down, and when the end of the punchline of the story, me wanting to study with him was, I indeed started studying with him, and had a lot of marathon phone calls, and I'd work on stuff and send him cassette tapes. And he ultimately invited me to start coming down and watch the old band rehearse, which was invaluable.
Which band?
So this is Bern and Jamal and Charlie and those guys. And what was so great about that was I remember going in at first, and everything kind of sounded alike to me. It was just this wall of sound. And Ornette and the band would occasionally, after a run through, go, "Oh yeah, well that was better. That was it." And they'd all agree. They'd all knew it, and I'd think it sounded just like the last. I can't tell what the difference is. Gradually, though, being there, and I would be able to go up when they take a break to Ornette, any of the guys, ask questions. They just seemed delighted that somebody was interested. And indeed, they're right there in the middle of Manhattan in the book. And a lot of times it was just me and the band for 10, 12, 14 hours. I mean, it was crazy. And it would be like, the only person at Disneyland. I mean, it was ridiculous. So, but it was great because I could ask very specific questions about what they had just played. So it was just, you can't imagine. Well, I know you can imagine because you've had the same experience with other musicians, I know. But John Turner and Chris Bowman, who I had a trio with at the time, sometimes they would go with me. And other times when I got back home, they'd say, "What did he say? What did he say? What happened?" And I would have to, in so many words, convey it to them. And at first, it was one of those things where, Ornette's way with the English language was pretty idiosyncratic. And I think, well, I understood it when he said it to me, but what exactly did he say now? And so I tried to, at first, verbatim work out what he'd said, but I soon found out that the best way to do it was as he was talking to me and as I understood it, simultaneously translate it to myself in terms that would be more comfortable to me, that I could understand. And so when I talked with them, they'd say, "What did he say? What did he say?" "Well, best I can figure, it's like this." And I would explain it in my own words. But having to do that was great because if I hadn't had to explain it to somebody else, I don't think I could have ever articulated it again. So between that and having taught it, I teach at the Lange School of Music here in Cambridge, ensemble class, and having to talk to so many different people about it for so long has really been a help for me just to get my own thinking more clear. But so anyway, sorry about that. Where did we leave off the question?
Talking about prime time.
Prime time. Oh, why he did it. Yeah, there's speculation, of course, that the master musicians of Jujuku in Morocco had a lot to do with. He was trying to recapture that kind of communal playing. And I know on Dancing in Your Head, Ornette did the overdub of that Moroccan drum that's on there that you can hear in addition to Ronald Shannon Jackson. And so I think, and of course, they've got that little excerpt of him playing with the Jujuku on there. And so I think there is something to that in some ways. And of course, that Dancing in Your Head, that theme from a symphony, that over and over repetition is, it's almost Mozartian on one hand, and on the other, it's reminiscent of the Jujukans. And so there's something about the total effect of that album being, see, it's sort of like this. I think for a lot of us, that kind of two guitar formula was reminiscent of like Get Up With It, Miles, and that kind of thing. Although I'm sure Ornette would have denied any influence there at all. But I think he probably wanted that, and I think he, as I said, he wanted the input of. He would probably rather have two people comping for him at once than one person comping for him.
Well, you see, this is interesting because when is Ornette's first use of electric guitar? Is it Body Meta?
Well, I guess Dancing in Your Head was released first, but I think they were recorded around the same time, I want to say, maybe.
I think so.
But before that, before those recordings, I know you can see on YouTube that quartet that he had with James Blood and Cerrone and Billy Higgins. And
That's
then,
first.
yeah. And then there was another prime time that didn't record that you can see on YouTube, because on our Third Thursdays concert series, I've done something with the bassist Fred Williams, who I played once with at Berkeley and tracked down. But there was a band that had Blood and Burn Nicks and Fred and DiNardo and Ronald Shannon Jackson. And so that was another first prime time. I guess that first quartet with Blood and Billy Higgins was sort of a proto prime time, and then prime time Roman numeral one, version one, was
And it's also a prototype for Tales of Captain Black by
yeah.
That's a great example of really what that would have sounded like.
Right. Oh, so I never finished up about the White House band. The way Bruce got in touch with Ornette about that was John Snyder's label, A&M Horizon, and then Artist House always had the transcriptions when you opened up the gatefold, and Bruce was the guy that did the transcriptions. And Bruce's brother, I think, also worked for the label, and Snyder was managing Ornette at the time, and then that's how that band got together. And it was supposed to be Ornette's experiment to see if he could communicate his theoretical ideas to schooled white musicians, was the way I heard it. Every once in a while, Ornette would say to me, "Well, you see, David, you're a schooled musician." And I always used to say, "Yeah, but this is the first time I was ever a good student." And he'd go, I hear you. But yeah, so that was really short of doing it. That's where I got my harmolodic sea legs, was those hours and hours of the other guys rehearsing and being able to interrogate them on the spot. And I did. Sorry, guys.
And so what kind of questions did you ask Ornette, and what kind of answers did he give you?
A lot of times it would take the form of, I think what I heard happening there was something like that. Is that why it was good? And he would be like, yes. And a lot of times that would have to do with relationships between instruments, and a way of how in the improvisations and in the relationships between musicians, phrasing together, or harmonic relationships, rhythmic relationships, they would sort of naturally, organically form into groupings that didn't necessarily last for the whole composition, but just sort of spontaneously spring up and morph and continue to develop. And then those would dissolve and other ones would form simultaneously, and they'd overlap, with that many musicians.
But it's interesting too how you mentioned this repetition of a shape and pieces that had sequential movement. Like I think of Airship from of Human Feeling, and and it's moving an idea around. It seems like that was a real preoccupation for him.
Yeah, that whole sequential thing, that was almost like, it always seemed to me that was kind of like a musical cubism for him. Taking a phrase and seeing it in different keys was like taking an object and seeing it from different angles, and having that and juxtaposing the points of view like that. So in some ways, what that gives you is the Uber motif. You know what I mean? As though, if like Andy Warhol or something like that, where you have these prints of the same photograph but in different colors, and then from that you can kind of suss out what that black and white photo of Marilyn Monroe or Chairman Mao or whoever it was really looked like, but you get that from different angles like that. So I always say it's like taking a phrase like that. I'm quoting myself. what I always say is, I'm talking about because this is why how I talk to students about it. But if you say a musical motif like that is like, say, a chair, having it in different keys is like painting the chair different colors. And so what you have to concern yourself with first is whether or not it's a sturdy enough chair to sit in. So that's how you get into talking about intervallic relationships and that type of thing. He had a very almost architectural view of how to construct a phrase intervallically, and always said the third was the most important interval, which was interesting. And but very much you can look at his phrases and see how they're developed. Not a lot of scalar passages, with runs in seconds. A lot of times it's larger intervals, and where you get this kind of, trapezoidal kind of.
Well, isn't it also triadic often?
Yeah, absolutely. But when the triads start to modulate, that's where a layer of harmonic complexity gets overlaid. So he never actually talks about scale degrees past a seventh, say. If you've got like 9, 11, 13, that's another triad imposed over the first one.
Right.
That's not, he never extends from the tonic note that far. He always imposes a secondary tonality rather than extend the first one that far.
But there's a question I had about that type of thing where I heard Ornette say once to a player, a fifth is the same as a seventh. And he would have this poetic way of relating things. And I heard him say, an apple is the same as an orange. And so I'm kind of wondering if that ties into his philosophy, or if that's something that he mathematically is thinking of intervals that way.
Well, you see, Greg, apples and oranges are both fruit. And no, when you said that about fifths and sevenths being the same, I went into my, Ornette translation head, and I thought, all right, what would I make of that? And I would say both fifths and dominant seventh, and seventh say to me dominant seven.
Okay.
Or major seven or whatever. But I would say probably for him that he would probably be thinking dominant seven, and dominant seven means bebop, And I'm just thinking about how the chain of thought that way works. But of course, it didn't just mean bebop as a style to him, but that way of organizing pitches and tonalities. But I would say that, yeah, a seventh is leading as a seventh is a leading tone chromatically to the tonic, and the fifth is also leading to the tonic in a 5-1 relationship. So to me, that would be what the fifth and seventh had in common from his point of view. And he would both say that was those are both like cadential relationships. First lesson I ever had with him, he said, he'd give you the Harmolodic 101 rap, but it would also be, here's what I'm working on this week. Would you like to join me in what I'm working on this week? Oh, yeah, sure. So he said, I've been working on trying to find a resolution without a cadence. And I thought, so I started thinking about it. And he was playing me a few things and writing a few things out. And I said, it's funny, the first thing I thought of was, and I guess would have been a cadence, but it wouldn't have been a 5-1 cadence, which is what I think he was talking about. And I did, I hummed one of those, or I may have played it, there may have been a keyboard there, but, like a trumpet fanfare with like a C major, D major, E major, da 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 da, like that. And I played it for him, and he goes, "That's not bad." But which was, his way of saying, yeah, technically that gets the job done. So that's useful. If that works, that's useful. Um, so the cadential thing. So yeah, he was very concerned with that about that, how to get from one place to another without having to set it up, if you will.
Hmm.
And so one thing he used to say was, one rehearsal, he said, "All right, you guys, what do you think a passing tone is?" And we always, different people kind of raised their hand and said, "Well, it's sort of like notes you use to get from one place to another, or one note to another, and the weak degrees of the scale and so forth." And I kind of held my ammo there, and because I knew I had a feeling where he was going was there were no passing tones, and sure enough, he says, I've been thinking, I don't think there's such a thing as passing tones. He says, because if a passing tone gets you from one place to another, he says, if I want to go somewhere, I don't have to use notes to get me there. I just go there.
This is
And so,
interesting because, this is something that occurs in Debussy, where not all of these modulations are prepared. And the idea is the move. And I think the move has a lot to do with film and a post-filmic way of thinking, a post-visual world where we can jump cut from thing to thing. And discontinuity is also a big issue as you come out of the 60s. So, it's if we give Ornette his due credit in terms of conceptualizing things that are occurring in art at large, certainly that's one. And of course, the compound interval thing, where he's not scalar, he's intervallic. Cecil also, by the way, very intervallic, maybe at times scalar, but not much. So it's kind of funny how you see these things relating in an abstract way, and they can be applied so openly. And I think that's part of it too, is the fluidity of these concepts in different settings.
it's amazing how so many people, and not just jazz, not just music, but in so many arts, felt as though they had to solve the same problems, felt like they were confronted with the same issues that had to be resolved, at the same time.
Sense of place, a sense of movement, sense of velocity and change, stasis, gravity.
Yeah, it's funny. It just seemed like things had led the arts to that moment, and certain things had to be resolved before they could progress. Interesting. But the eureka moment, as far as that no passing tones thing, for me anyway, was there were a lot of things he talked about, and some of them, like clefs, he'd get into, and a lot of times, playing a concert equal tempered instrument, that didn't always it wasn't as revelatory a way of looking at it for me as it was for him, I think, for his journey as a horn player and finding out about transposing instruments and that type of thing.
Well, let me ask you, before we go on though, let me ask you about Ornette's violin playing and his trumpet playing. What was that for you?
Well, for one thing, I wouldn't put them together. The trumpet playing was much more traditionally melodic than the violin playing. The violin thing for him could be, an energy kind of a more of an abstracted, physical kind of approach, whereas the trumpet thing, he had tremendous range and flexibility on the horn, and people I know, a lot of musicians, that once they finally listened to him on trumpet in later years, were amazed. They were like, I didn't know he could really play like that. And so even though he would tend to sort of lump them together at the end of the set, at least when I was playing with him, at the grand finale, he'd do a thing where he'd go through all the instruments and so forth. And I think part of it was like juxtaposing instruments the same way you juxtapose keys. And it was also not lost on me that Cecil's front line in the great late 70s band was alto, trumpet, violin. But I thought, there's something about the relationship of those three instruments. But there was one time, again, we were talking on the tour bus, and he said, oh, I know what it was. There was like the second tune of the night was this kind of bluesy ballad that he'd written. And you can imagine the kind of solo he'd take on that every night and just knock it out of the park. Just great. Just, on the alto, and just right up his alley. And we were talking on the bus, and I said, because sometimes I would say things to him sort of to provoke him a little bit, be a little bit of a devil's advocate, and just to see what he'd say, And I said, you always end the night with the trumpet and the violin. And I said, maybe it'd be cool sometime to go out and like you'd open with the violin. And he went, woo, like this, like, oh man, like, what are you saying now? That, you're upsetting the apple cart now. And we didn't say too much more about it. And I said, but yeah, I just thought about that. And I said, I'm just thinking about what effect that would have on the sound of the music and the way you conceptualized your own playing, to start from there and then continue from that with the alto. And, whatever. So didn't think much more of it. Next gig, we get to that second tune. That's his big alto showcase. Puts down the alto, picks up the violin. And I thought, oh, wow. Because immediately what I realized was, all right, Mr. Smartass, you thought you could challenge me. Well, here's what I'm willing to give up. What are you willing to give up to get to the next step? And I went, oh, don't poke the bear if you don't want to, take what's coming. So that was, what an amazing thing that was. What a courageous thing for him to do that. And like I said, that was just, there was a certain aspect of his playing which was so great that he got to showcase every night. And so part of it, I'm thinking, what did I do? But I don't think it would just be. I think that it, he related to what I was saying, and he wanted to see what that would do too. But that was interesting. On the business with the no passing tones, he said to us one time on the band, so any two triads, major, minor, augmented, diminished, either have a note in common or they're only separated by a half step. And we're all sitting around and we went, no, he's right. He's right. And I remember Al McDowell told me this story once about, he was in a bar talking to Joe Zawinul, and Zawinul says, when he talked, he said, hey man, what's up with this harmolodic stuff, man? And Al says, well, a lot of times on the bus, Ornette will give us little exercises or brain teasers or something like that. And he said, just today he was saying that any two triads either have a note in common or just separated by a half step. And he says, Joe goes, oh yeah, well, what about C major and F sharp major? And Al says, well, you see, you got the F sharp and F sharp major, the G and the C major, that's a half step. You got a C and C major and the C sharp and F sharp major, that's another half step like that. So Joe goes, so what? He was not about to be impressed by the likes of that. But for me, what was amazing was I realized that I could modulate from anywhere to anywhere else on a dime, either by using a common tone transposition or a leading tone transposition. So in other words, I didn't have to set it up with a circle of fifths or something to get from one place.
That's understood, and that's fair. I guess what I'm trying also to understand my whole life of listening to Ornette with all the different groupings that he played in is the simultaneity of all of the voices going in a tune and what it is he's hearing there, what he's hoping to hear there. Are there roles, roles, that are taken on by certain players that they're assigned? Are bass players somehow fundamental? What can you tell us about that, Dave?
I always felt it was sort of like that constant self-monitoring between the players of the relationship, almost like that intervallic relationship between the musicians, if you will.
But not a key center.
No, not so much. I mean, you're sort of passing in between and through different key centers. And of course, one way to sort of stay on the same page is through being in the same key, but that's not the only way. And so one way to do it, again, is intervallically. If you have that, use that as an organizing principle, you can have that. And the way you would do that would be more motivically too, but it's, first of all, a lot of that, though, was very much, I don't want to say, if you say intuitively, that implies something so ephemeral you can't articulate it or something like that. And it wasn't that spacey, but it was more like just keeping track of where the other guy was, and then trying to keep that relationship constant and balanced. And so that balance, it would be what you're hearing, and when that happens successfully. I remember Bern Nix used to say that bad harmolodics was like spaghetti. He'd always say that. Listen to those lines. That's just spaghetti. And so I think I came up with that good harmolodics and was more like plaid, where you got
Well,
everything doesn't have to be right angles though, but still, but those relationships that are pleasingly spaced and pleasingly constant in some fashion.
could there have been instances where he was hoping for or asking for registral partitioning?
Charlie Ellaby, I remember, was talking to me one time about how Ornette would talk to him a lot of times about, I guess, orchestrational kind of ideas like, all right, if Bern's playing single lines, you play chords. If he's playing in a high register, you play in a low register, something like that. And so he did, I think, definitely, it wasn't so much that he was looking for variety, I would say. I guess the way I would think about it is he was trying to avoid redundancy, if that makes sense. And he always used to say to me, get after me, that my playing was so linear. Well, part of it was because what I was learning from him was linear in a large sense, precisely because he was a horn player. But he'd say to me, why don't you play more notes at once? He'd say, I would if I could, but I can't. And he'd say, don't play chords, play sounds. And that was the other thing about the passing tone and not wanting chromatic voice leading, the traditional kind of things we do with diminished chords and that type of thing, going from one place to another in a progression. And he would very much like, the way people play giant steps on the piano with triads in the right hand with a melody note on top. Dun, 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 dun. And you pick it up and you take those triads and pick them up and put them down, and they just jump around like that. And that was like the kind of company liked. Not so much for the leap, but it was, he didn't want, again, this is that that type of chord progression would be very much of a horizontal linear chronology. You know what I mean? Going from here to here in time, beginning, middle, end. And even though he was a master of that too, and he could keep his eye on the forest and the trees, he wanted that thing also of it all, every moment. He didn't want that bellows breath that traditional European harmony is based on, a weak and strong and weak and strong, weak and strong. He wanted strong, 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 strong. And that meant triad, primary color, primary color, primary color all the time. And how it worked in juxtaposition to each other was how the progression, if you will, worked. That was where the harmonic complexity came in. That was where the chronology of it came in, was just in the juxtaposition of these relative strengths. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think that is what's going on. I'm not sure always when I listen how it's achieved or what the process is, but you've definitely given me some insight on that. I appreciate that. I was curious if in your time around Ornette, if you ever had any moments or run-ins with Don Cherry or Charlie Haydn.
Of all the guys, I always thought that I would hit it off with Charlie. That here two guys that grew up in a relatively rural part of the country, and I just thought we had a lot in common, and I had just idolized his work so much with Keith. And first jazz concert I saw in Richmond, Virginia was Gary Burton's quintet with Pat and Mick Goodrick and Steve Swallow and Bob Moses, with Eberhard Weber sitting in, opening up for Keith's American Quartet. And that was one of them life changers. Just too much, because I had just gotten, you remember in Downbeat, when you subscribed, you could get a free album, and you had to select what album you wanted. And so I got Death in the Flower. And that's what they opened with that night. And just an amazing experience. And I knew there was some relationship there between what Keith was doing and Ornette, because I'd heard a little about Ornette's music, but I didn't really know it at that point. I knew Keith more, so I backed into Ornette's music through Keith's American Quartet. And part of what I wanted to learn was how to write those kind of triadic sounding tunes, those major key sounding tunes. But I knew there was something different between the way Keith did it and the way Ornette did it. And what was the difference, under the hood? And I think a lot of it was that Keith, as a piano player, did use a lot of 5/1 kind of setups that Ornette was trying to involve. But anyway, with Charlie, yeah, I don't know personally, he was pleasant enough, but the guy that really went out of his way to be really warm and welcoming to me was Cherry. And I didn't expect that at all. The first gig I did with Ornette was that same week. The quartet was going to be playing with him too at the same festival. And I was backstage afterwards, and I had this, hey man. And I look over, and it's Cherry on the other side of the stage. He goes, hey man, are you the piano player? And I said, yeah. And he goes, oh man, he says, I just want to tell you, I think it really takes something special to hear the piano in this music, and man, just, good luck to you. And I thought, wow, that's so nice, because I'd had some interaction with Charlie, and it just been a little, I don't know, he just hadn't been that direct, hadn't been that warm, hadn't been that forthcoming. And I had sought him out. But with Cherry, I hadn't, and I'm a little afraid of Cherry. You know what I mean? Because I've heard stories. He was so striking visually in person, where, I mean, he's striking in photographs, but it was like seeing a movie star that looks that way on the screen that really does look that way in real life. Don Cherry really did look that way, you know?
Yeah, it's true. I remember that. Yeah.
And so the next day, I went out, I was walking out the front door of the hotel and walking down the street, and I saw Cherry on the edge of the sidewalk, and he was walking at one foot in front of the other with his arms like he was a trapeze artist, you know, like this, and he's balancing. And I was like, oh, my man's going out here. I thought I lucked out last night, but I could keep my head down this morning. And I walked past him, and I hear behind me, hey man, hey man. And I thought, oh wow, is he talking to me again? And I turned around and yeah. And he goes, do you know Billy Higgins? Billy just flew in. Billy, this is Dave. And I was like, I felt so stupid. I felt so small, you know. I thought, why didn't I just say, Don, how you doing, man? But yeah, I knew from then every time I saw him afterwards, he would come over. And I remember, you know, at rehearsal, he'd listen to a primetime rehearsal, and on a break, he'd come over and lean over my shoulder and show me some voicings and talk about Charlie Parker, and the relationship of his music to bebop and so forth. And a lot of times he kind of had this, you know, kind of a slightly hoarse whisper, and I couldn't always pick up all of what he was saying even, but it was, you know, me trying to follow it. And of course, at the same time, there's the self that's outside of myself watching this happen, going, Don Cherry is leaning over my shoulder playing my keyboard. But I remember also there was one night that he and I were both staying at Ornette's place after rehearsal. And I said at one point, I'm going to run downstairs and get something to drink. Would you guys like anything? And Cherry says, I'd like a pack of cigarettes here. And he gets out a couple of bucks, you know, and hands it to me. And Ornette's kind of, you know, like this, flustered by it. And, you know, Ornette's walking me in the door, and he's saying something like, I wish he wouldn't do that. You know, like he didn't like it. Like Ornette felt like like Cherry was asking somebody in his band to wait. You know, it was almost like that. Like he felt like that. And of course, I'm thinking, Don Cherry asked me to buy him a pack of cigarettes. This is the greatest day of my life. You know, I mean, it was not like that for me at all. But Ornette very much had that kind of thing where one day I hired Don and one day I hired you. You know, I mean, it's like, again, not the way I saw things, but that was the way Ornette saw things, you know, very much. And so I got him his cigarettes. So also worth mentioning maybe is I was with Ornette when word came in that Don had passed. We were getting ready for a car to come and take us to the airport. We were leaving for a tour. And I remember telling Ornette, you know, I got this idea. You know how you always feel so scuzzy when you get off the plane? I said, I'm going to take a shower now. And I'm going to see, you know, you try to get your road chops together. And I said, I want to see then if I feel like hipper, you know, fresher when I get off the plane. And he goes, all right, well, that sounds like a good idea. So I went and took a shower. And when I came back and got out of the shower, he had gotten the call while I was in the shower. And it's not lost on me that Ornette has just heard that Don Cherry has died. And it's me and Ornette sitting here. And then it was me and Ornette in the car together going to the airport. And I'm thinking, I know there are perfect words to say here, but darn if I know what they are. And every once in a while, you know, he'd look out the window or something and kind of shake his head. Don Cherry. You know, and I would try to prompt him a little bit with I read in an interview that he said when he met you, something, something, something. And you're like, yeah. But, you know, he didn't really want to talk like that. You know, I felt a little obligated to say something. And yet at the same time, I felt obligated to leave him alone. So,
that's so interesting too, that we understand the importance of those relationships, you know, Ornette and Cherry and Cecil and Jimmy Lyons. And you just brought to mind how I was around when Jimmy Lyons passed, and I knew that he was ill because I was studying with Andrew Cyril, and I knew that we were working on dedicatory pieces on Inflorescence, Jay being the opening track for Jimmy. And when these guys lose that guy and you hear them talk about it, I just want to communicate what, reiterate what Dave said. It's just a profound loss of a musical partner who was the perfect foil in each case. I mean, who would you say other than Cherry and Ornette and Cecil and Jimmy Lyons?
Yeah, yeah. One time I was he was talking about, I guess I can't remember what the setup was right now, but it was something where the way maybe an interviewer or somebody had asked him about Don Cherry in a way that had sort of inquired as to what Cherry contributed to Harmolodic, say, or something like that. And I think Ornette maybe had, I don't want to say bristled at it, but I think that he very much felt that this initial conception of his was not a communal conception. It was very much a personal thing that he had then brought to other musicians and had cultivated these relationships, if that's fair. And he was trying to express this, why this question had frustrated him or had hadn't suited him for some reason. And as I was listening to him, I just happened to think this, and I kind of blurted out, "Are you saying that Don Cherry was like Dizzy Gillespie?" And he wheeled around and stared me in the eye and said, "Exactly." And I thought, wow. Because I knew he didn't have anything against Dizzy Gillespie, but I knew that for him, Bird was the man.
And for Jimmy Lyons, Bird is the man. And Jimmy Lyons is Bird in Cecil's group. And I wanted to add also this point for our listeners, that when I was working with Ornette on the Harmolodic Chamber Players piece in 2000, I had a moment where I got to ask Ornette about Jimmy Lyons in particular and Eric Dolphy, because I had always sort of thought of them as being like the three most important post Charlie Parker alto players for the kind of music that I was into, or certainly our brand of avant-garde jazz. Like, these were the guys who were carrying the torch for those guys. And Ornette was super complimentary and enthusiastic that I brought them up. Oh yeah, Jimmy Lyons, oh, Eric Dolphy, they were just amazing, doing incredible things. Whereas I would have thought there'd been some kind of competition or something, but you see later, like Ornette's playing at the end with Sonny Rollins, and there's this sense of community among players who you would think maybe had a competition, because I think, as you know, Dave, Ornette was also quite competitive.
I think with those guys, it's almost like a sibling thing where they could throw some shade on the other horn player, but don't you do it. You know what I mean? So it's, represent it to somebody else. They could, when it came right down to it, they very much respected each other. Ornette told me a great story one time, though, about when he was living in California and trying to get into the scene there, with Clifford Brown and, Dolphy and not making much headway, the way he described it. But he said, I've been working on something, and I came up with this idea. It was like, some theoretical kind of thing. And he said, I went over to Eric's house and I just wanted to show him this. So, man, I said, oh man, Eric, I found this thing and I want to show it to you. And he said, oh, come on in, Ornette. And he said, yeah, listen, I want to play something from you. And he said, he sat me down in front of his record player and he said, he put on this record and he says, hang on a minute, I'll be right back. And he says, I found out a few minutes later, he left out the back door and didn't come back.
Yeah.
So, they've been through some stuff together, no question.
Yeah, I remember being at a Cecil party, and a woman named Jeannie Phillips told me that she was Dolphy's girlfriend at some point in LA. And she said, you know, we'd be at a party and Eric would be in the back room practicing, you know. And it's such a great snapshot of what, you know, what was going on. Another thing I wanted to get on the record too about Ornette is when Cecil and I were invited to go see the Grateful Dead at Madison Square Garden, and it just so happened that Ornette and Donato were there at the same time. I was fascinated by the fact that Ornette, out of nowhere, I can't remember what the context was, in a conversation with Phil Lesh, said the only white man who could ever sing the blues was Captain Beefheart.
Well, I know they were friends, and because I remember he said to me one time, he says, "Oh yeah, I know him. Don used to come over and show me his paintings." He'd say,
Yeah, and another guy, Visual Sonic, right there too.
Yeah, and then definitely musician again that had that personal breakthrough that they then would communicate as a communal experience.
Yeah. Well, this has been a communal experience talking to you, Dave. I mean, we can go on and on, but I feel like we've covered a lot of ground here today.
Well, I've so many times I've watched the ProgCast and wished I could join in the conversation as you do with all good interviews. So,
well, this is all connected for us here at the ProgCast, and Ornette was certainly a forward-moving artist. I mean, he inspired us from an early age, and I still find things about his music that, oh, I got to really listen to this, you know, Ornette on tenor record more, or I got to listen to Native Beauty, or, you know, one of those, and certainly the record that you're on, which is Tone Dialing.
yeah, the twain never meets. I work on that gig still every day. You know, I mean, it's if you trying to reach that harmolodic core through equal temperament is like you know, trying to reach absolute zero. You can come close, but what's good is once you get close, you can see what the differences are, and you know what, when you know what the trade-offs are, then you can deal with it.
I think that's a good strategy for improvisational music.
And life, yeah.
Well, thanks. My guest has been Dave Bryant, keyboardist extraordinaire, member of Ornette Coleman's Prime Time, longtime collaborator and friend of Ornette. And Ornette certainly has shared some insights with you, Dave, and thank you for sharing them with us.
I will mention one other thing. Our CD that we did together, Night Visitors with Charnette Moffett. Ornette, a lot of times when people would ask him about different sidemen, he would say something to the effect of, oh, you know, when he played with me, he was playing really good. And so I never want to be that guy. But if you're a Gregg Bendian fan, I have to say, he sounds really good on this.
Well, that was a fun interaction. I got to record with one of the great bass players, Charnette Moffett, knew what his lineage was. And you and I had worked together previously, and we always had that connection. So yeah, Night Visitors, is it on Bandcamp? I know it's on Spotify.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do recommend that one. It's funny, you're right. I've tried to play differently on everybody's stuff, and I think you got something different out of me on that one for sure.
Well, it's great because we get to hear all sides of your playing. Just a wide range, and everything from the straight ahead to the glockenspiel to some you know, power fusionish stuff. So it's very nice. And again, it's not jumping from place to place, but it's living in that place where all these different cross currents can talk together, you know.
It might be my only recorded Dumbek performance. I'm trying to think. I know I also did some hand drumming. Oh no, there's also the Derek Bailey banter, but yeah, it's a nice variety of things, and I think one of Charnette's final recordings.
Yeah. No, that was great. just when I had the initial idea to put you guys together, that was strange. If you don't mind, if I just say this, when I was lying in bed one night and kind of putting together imaginary bands in my head, and just it was like, you pull down the arm of the slot machine, and Ornette Bendian came up, and I thought, sat upright in bed. I mean, it was one of those things where it was almost like it was such a perfect pairing, because it was almost like musically you were the same people in a strange way. And I only knew because I had very significant experiences playing with both of you separately, but I had no idea how you were going to sound together. And I realized that other people would have that same reaction. Wow, they're both really good, but I can't imagine how they would sound together. So I knew the pairing would be provocative, but also I kind of realized how I would have to play with you. And very much, a lot of times in my own music, I set everything up so it's easy for me. I get to play the way I want to play. And for that, it was very much, I was sort of a method actor on that one. I had to, what's my motivation here? I sort of created a character and walked into that world, which is not generally.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, not usually the way I would work or prefer to work, but for that one, that was very much, the way it went. So I was very surprised by it, and yet it was almost like between you guys, such a perfect pairing. It was as though somehow it had happened already, somewhere out there at some other, David Lynch dimension. And yet this time we were just putting it together on this plane here. So that was really was an amazing experience that way. Very unique in my personal experience, but great thing to be able to share that with you and Ornette.
And I was able to share with Ornette my admiration for his dad and how that trio with Eisenzen and his father with Ornette's music was special to me. So maybe that's an insight too. We both had been influenced by Charles Moffett.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was really interesting too, because I kind of think you're right. We did come from a similar place. And I also knew that his dad played glockenspiel.
Yeah, but you both present in a way that I found very similar, where it's not just, you're playing and the mic happens to be picking it up. You're very much present like a good public speaker. You both have that kind of flair of as communicators of being very clear and direct with your statement, and have a similarly wide range of stylistic things you can get into too. So having said that, obviously from different backgrounds, different places, but I remember after we did the first tune and we go back to the control room, and my wife said that Ornette leaned over to her and said, I guess Dave and Gregg play together a lot, huh? And she said, not really. So never enough, but yeah, it was the things that came up there, mixing that thing and just hearing the way you guys related and the way you both set me up and managed to display your own virtuosity, never get in my way, but always be very sensitive to the ensemble, pick your spots and project like that. Just masterful. So just a great experience. Thank you.
Oh, what a pleasure. And Dave, where can everybody find these videos of these cool shows and interviews you're doing?
I guess the YouTube channel is Dave Bryant Music, and it's a concert series sponsored by the Appalachian Springs Foundation, which is run by some folks that I knew through Ornette, and they had a furtherance of Ornette's theoretical and musical legacy as part of their mission statement. And they've underwritten the concert series Third Thursdays that we do the third Thursday of every month here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we post a highlight video every month from that. And when it's an Ornette sideman, I do a little oral history chat with them, and we try to get some things on the record. So we've had some of the greats, Calvin Weston and McDowell, and a lot of great people. So check us out. Some good things.
Look for that, definitely, folks. It's very informative, very cool insights into Ornette's world and through the people that he collaborated with. And you get to hear some really cool music as well. So maybe we'll leave it there for today. Dave Bryant has been my guest. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, everybody, for listening. As always, you can hit us at bendianmusic.com if you have any comments you want to pass along. I do appreciate all of the feedback and just so much positive energy coming from everybody that checks out these things. And on the road with Mahavishnu Project, I have people coming up to me all the time telling me their favorite episodes or their favorite question. And I'm so glad we're heading into our 3rd anniversary and our 100th episode coming up. So it's great to have Dave here, and we'll see you all next time, everybody. Thanks. Please hit us on Patreon and like and subscribe. Take care.